It's really a pleasure to be here. The Tufts Environmental Studies program is, well known as one of these great environmental studies programs. Particularly, I have a love for undergraduate liberal arts programs. And also, I'm a Tufts townie. So even though I teach across the river at Boston College, I actually live right over here. It was lovely it was like a 15-minute walk over from my house, past the Tufts athletic fields. And so it's a pleasure to get to chat with all of you. And I know I was encouraged to leave time at the end for questions. I will, but also even better, if you want to interrupt me along the way and ask questions, something sparks your interest, something is confusing, and you're like, I'm super lost, I don't need to wait until the end. Like, please interrupt me, ask questions. That's more fun for everyone. So I'm going to address this question of can the ocean clean up our carbon mess? And credit to Dr. Catherine Wilkinson and Dr. Leah Stokes, who are really important people in the climate space thinking about how we can frame the problem of climate change and climate solutions, who have a really great podcast where they were talking about the idea of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cleaning up our carbon mess. And before I get into my research, including spending some time out on this ship, the RV Neil Armstrong, at the location of this cool buoy in the middle of the subpolar North Atlantic, I was asked to start off with some reflections on my career path and how I got here. And so Ethan gave a lovely introduction to sort of where I've been from college on. And I usually don't do this when I talk about my career path, but I can actually say that I got my start in being a chemist measuring environmental chemistry in water in middle school. I had the opportunity attending a public school in Western Pennsylvania to be part of the very early movement of this GLOBE program founded by NASA, but also supported by the National Science Foundation and the Department of Defense and NOAA, that gets school students around the country in the US and all around the world to basically do citizen science, collecting data as part of global observations with the goal of protecting the environment. And so at age 11, this is a really old picture of me. I actually digitized it from a physical photo album that was in my basement. I had the amazing opportunity to travel with some of my public school, middle school classmates to go to Helsinki, Finland, and present at the first of what's now become a regular series of these global learning expeditions, bringing together students participating in this program from all around the world. And so some of the measurements that I made in 6th grade, like in a stream near my school of dissolved oxygen, are the same kinds of measurements that I make, in a kind of fancier way today in my lab at Boston College. But I often don't start with this story about like, oh, you can like make this path all the way back to what I was doing in 6th grade. And I particularly don't like to do that with undergraduate students because it gives this idea that if you didn't figure out your life path by the time you were in middle school, like you're already behind the curve. I talk to freshmen and sophomores all the time who are trying to figure out what to major in, and they're like, I feel so behind, I haven't figured it all out. And so there's one way you can tell the story where I had it all figured out in 6th grade and I followed the story from there, but that is not the true story of my life. I also loved English and history and poetry. I thought the coolest job that I wanted to have, maybe not thinking that much about what job means, was to sit in a coffee shop and write poetry. And that's what I wanted to do with my life when I started college. And it actually wasn't until my junior year that I did this really amazing interdisciplinary study away program, the Williams-Mystic Maritime Studies program. It's super environmental studies. If any of you are earlier on in your time at Tufts and thinking about maybe an interest in the ocean and wanting to explore something off campus, I can't recommend this program too much. On their website today, I took this screenshot. It calls it a life-changing semester. And it was certainly a life-changing semester for me because, as Ethan knew to say in the introduction, the ocean is the biggest pool of carbon. And also, if you're interested in studying water chemistry, wow, there's so much water in the ocean. But I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and I went to college in Western Mass, and weirdly to say, I just didn't think of studying the ocean until my junior year. When I did this amazing program. This is a picture of me out at sea on the Corwith Kramer, my first time getting to go to sea. I made some of those same dissolved oxygen measurements, a little bit higher quality than in sixth grade, not quite as high quality as the measurements I make today. And that was the thing that hooked me and eventually sent me on this path to becoming a chemical oceanographer and climate scientist and doing the work that I'm doing today. So now taking a big step back, I imagine everyone in this room is familiar with the concept of climate change, but I'm going to give sort of the big picture overview of where I start from in thinking about these problems. So we know that the sun emits radiation that comes into the Earth, and we know that the Earth is the temperature it is today, largely because of this heat trapping blanket of gases, especially carbon dioxide, around the planet. And we know that over time, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has both increased and decreased over time. And we know from paleoclimate records that the Earth's global temperature has increased and decreased in concert with those changes in the atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. We also know that more recently, we have added anthropogenic carbon to the atmosphere from fossil fuel burning and land use change, such that when I checked on Monday, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is now 430 parts per million. And I've been giving this talk for years, and each time I update the number, and each time the number is higher. So we can put in context, this is the data for what I just showed you, the carbon dioxide going up and down over time, and then this really steep increase in the modern era. And so this is a really quick overview from the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change assessment report of all of those things that increased carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is doing for our Earth system. We're seeing more extreme precipitation of both droughts and flooding. We're seeing loss of glacier mass, both on land and reduction in sea ice. We're seeing rising global temperatures, rising sea levels, and rising ocean heat content. And as I imagine everyone in this program is well aware of, that matters not just because we're interested in the Earth system as a whole, but because of the really huge impacts that is having on ecosystems, as well as especially on human populations. And so that's why we care about what's happening to the climate system. And so we can get a little bit more into how did we get into this mess. So zooming into the more modern era, this is looking at this carbon mess, human carbon emissions from the 1850s up until today. And this is the rate of carbon emissions per year. So we can see that land use change, this orange wedge, has been relatively stable with some increases and decreases over time. And fossil carbon emissions have just continued to go up over time. So pumping more and more carbon into the atmosphere each year. And then we can ask, so what happens to that mess? What fraction of the carbon dioxide emitted by humans stays in the atmosphere? And so can I get some hands, like who thinks like basically all of it? Okay, who thinks about a third of it stays in the atmosphere? Half of it? 3/4? Okay, so wide range. People definitely in this room have gotten that it doesn't all stay in the atmosphere. There's some other places it goes. And the two main places it goes are these blue wedges, the ocean carbon sink, and green, the land carbon sink. And so in sum, about half of the carbon that we emit is being taken up by the land or the ocean, rather than staying in this blue atmospheric wedge. And so we can zoom in on the data I showed earlier. This is our famous Keeling curve, showing the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And not only has it gone up really fast over time, it's gone up at about half the rate it would have if we didn't have the carbon cycle and the ocean and the land absorbing some of those carbon emissions. And so the carbon cycle is really complicated. Understanding all of those interactions between the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean. But we can make it a little bit simpler. So we can think of the atmosphere like a bathtub, where our inputs are emissions and our outputs are these net removals, the land and ocean carbon sink. And so when you hear people talking about the global carbon budget, they're thinking about the budget for how much carbon we can fit in our theoretical bathtub of the atmosphere before we imagine we reach some point that that bathtub would overflow. And so there's amazing work by a huge international collaborative team of scientists in the Global Carbon Project, where they basically keep track of all of those parts of the global carbon budget, and they update it every single year. And so from their recent assessment, we can see that if we decide that we want to stay within 1.5 degree or less of warming, the target set just over 10 years ago from the Paris Agreement, we have used up almost all of that carbon budget. And if we widen that threshold a little bit more, we say we'd be willing to get to 1.7 or 2 degrees. We have a little bit more of that carbon budget left before we imagine that bathtub overflowing. But we can see that we're really running out of sort of space in our metaphorical atmospheric bathtub. And so about a year ago, the New York Times published this analysis saying, what would it take for us to actually stay within that budget if we wanted to stay within a 1.5 degree warming target? And they point out that if we had started reducing emissions rapidly in 2005, we could have stayed within that target by reducing fairly gradually. If we had reduced at the time of the Paris Agreement in 2015, it would have been harder. We would have had to reduce faster, but maybe could have pulled it off. But starting what they named as today, which was actually a year ago, their assessment is that it is nearly impossible to imagine that we can decarbonize fast enough, right? This really fast drop off to actually stay within that 1.5 degree carbon budget. And that is the really sobering news that we're going to start out with. We're not going to stay in this negative place, but I think that's really important, sobering news, and important context for thinking about this question of, can the ocean help us with this problem? And the other thing that I want to say as I use this framing of the carbon budget bathtub, I think it's a really useful science communication framing, but it's also flawed. It's flawed as a science communication framing in some ways, and it's also flawed as a technical framing because we know that the atmosphere is not actually a bathtub. There's not some point at which the atmosphere overflows and all hope is lost. And I put up this figure. I actually think it is the most important new finding from the last IPCC report that has gotten kind of the least coverage. And that is, for a while, we weren't really sure whether, as we kept emitting more CO2 into the atmosphere, there might be some tipping point at which warming would completely take off, or maybe the warming would flatten out. And it's increasingly clear that that's actually not the case. There's this really basic, boring, linear relationship between increasing carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and increasing temperatures from both our historical observations and our best Earth system model projections. So if we have really high emissions, we get more warming. If we have lower emissions, we get less warming. But the important takeaway is that we can find it really useful to say, we're almost out of time. We need to decarbonize right now because we're going to overflow the bathtub. But I think all of you are ready for the more nuanced understanding that also every bit of carbon that we don't put into the atmosphere makes a difference. Whether we could do even better than hitting that Paris Agreement target, that would be even better. And if we go past that target and we're going to get to 2 degrees, we know that it's still going to make a difference if we can keep from getting from 2 to 2.1 or to 2.2 degrees. Every bit of that difference matters, which I think is really important for, everyone in this room who is thinking about what your role in the solution is. There's no point at which all hope is lost. So, getting back to this bathtub, we know that absolutely the most important thing we need to do is we need to stop emissions. We need to turn off this faucet. But given the place that we're at now, where it seems clear that we can't do that fast enough to avoid going past the level of 1.5 degrees of warming, there's been increasing conversations about carbon dioxide removal, basically opening the drain and trying to get more carbon out of the atmosphere. And so if you look at all of the different targets for what it would look like to have the world we want by 2100, imagining, okay, so we don't want to be in this business as usual scenario where we just keep on emitting until we run out of fossil fuels. We want to do some sort of decrease in our emissions, but also we're going to need some of this gross negative CO2 emissions to pull some carbon out of the atmosphere, both if we want to get to net zero emissions, where people talk about, maybe we're not going to get our emissions all the way to zero, but if we balance a little bit of emissions with a little bit of removals, we can eventually get to net zero. And so as we're making these projections for what the future might look like, all the futures that any of us want to live in, the consensus is increasingly we're going to need some kind of carbon dioxide removal, either pulling that carbon directly out of the atmosphere or enhancing how much carbon is being taken up by the land and the ocean. So the question is really, can we get the land and ocean carbon sinks to do more for us than the amazing amount that they already have been doing and continue to do? And so this is where we get to the kind of expertise that people like me, marine biogeochemists, have been thinking about for a long time. That if we want to evaluate the ocean side of this, marine carbon dioxide removal, we have to understand how the ocean absorbs and stores carbon today. And I'll give a little bit of a framing here for why I think about the ocean in particular, other than just that's where my expertise is. There's actually been a lot of framing earlier where people focused on increasing the land carbon sink when people talk about reforestation or afforestation, proposals of planting 1 trillion trees, right? Those are sort of where people thought about first, and how can we get the ecosystems that exist to store more carbon. We focused on the land first. However, there are a number of challenges in doing that. One is that people live on the land, and so we're competing for land with agriculture and places that people live. There are a lot of challenges, it turns out, that it might not be the best idea to just plant 1 trillion trees and other ecosystems that already exist. And also it can be much harder to ensure that the carbon stored on land is stored durably and long-term, and that we can actually measure how much is stored, just because it's actually harder to measure the land sink today. And we have things like wildfires being exacerbated by climate change that can put some of those carbon stores at risk. So much more recently, scientists have been thinking, well, what about the ocean? It covers more than half the planet. People don't live there. It stores huge amounts of carbon. What if we could increase what the ocean was doing for us? So to get into that, first we have to think about what we know about the ocean carbon sink to begin with. And so when I said the ocean is taking up about 1/4 of our current emissions, right, it's not evenly distributed over the ocean. This map shows the annual exchange of carbon between the ocean and atmosphere. So there are all these regions in blue where the ocean is a net sink, taking up carbon from the atmosphere. But there are also these regions in red that are net sources, emitting carbon back to the atmosphere. And when we go out and make these observations, we're seeing a combination of the baseline natural cycling of carbon between the ocean and atmosphere with an anthropogenic signal imprinted over top of it that we need to then be able to pull out of these data. So the kind of work that I and other scientists in my field do is often really trying to get under the hood and understand what are the mechanistic controls, the biological, chemical, and physical mechanisms that allow the ocean to take up carbon from the atmosphere. And so a lot of my work focuses on the biological side of things, where we have phytoplankton in the surface ocean, like this lovely picture of diatoms. They photosynthesize and convert carbon dioxide into organic carbon, and some fraction of that organic carbon escapes being respired by bacteria and zooplankton in the surface ocean and sinks out into the deep ocean, where it can be sequestered from contact with the atmosphere on timescales from months to centuries. And then in addition to this biological mechanism, we also have abiotic mechanisms where physical circulation and the solubility of carbon dioxide in water can allow particularly cold waters in the surface ocean to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and then be mixed down into the deep ocean, again, storing them away from contact with the atmosphere on timescales from months to centuries. So that gets us to some of these ideas that people have been talking about for how could we juice up some of these mechanisms and get the ocean to store even more carbon. And I'm not going to go into all of the details of these today. This is really like a brief tour of how we think about this question. But broadly, in the menu of proposed marine carbon dioxide removal approaches, there's two categories. One are these biotic methods, where the idea is basically enhance this biological carbon pump. So some of these ideas are to go out to places in the ocean where we know that the phytoplankton would grow more if we gave them more nutrients, basically more fertilizer. And because of how expensive and difficult it would be to transport that fertilizer out to the ocean, we tend to focus on places where the thing that the phytoplankton are missing is the micronutrient iron. And the idea is maybe if we gave the phytoplankton iron, they would photosynthesize a lot, that would move carbon into the deep ocean and store it for a long time, right? That's a lot of ifs. We'll come back to that. People also imagine maybe instead of providing fertilizer, we could directly do more of like an agriculture type process where we can cultivate macroalgae, so things like kelp in the surface ocean, and then we can sink it down into the deep ocean, attach it to something heavy and just get it down into the deep ocean and let it decompose way down in the deep ocean out of contact with the atmosphere. There's then a second category of options that people think about. I'll start first with the direct ocean removal because that's the easiest to wrap your head around, which is basically to have a mechanism where you pump some seawater in and you use an engineering chemical mechanism to strip the carbon out of the water. You store that carbon somewhere durable or in a product on land. And then you put that low CO2 water back in the ocean where it will passively absorb more carbon from the atmosphere. And then the other approach to doing that is instead of using an engineering or chemical mechanism at a carbon extraction plant, we could do this basically by modifying the chemistry of seawater. If you've heard about ocean acidification, we know that as you add CO2 to water, it makes the water more acidic. You can basically go the other direction, people are thinking, and add some alkalinity to the ocean, something to counteract that acidification, which would then allow the ocean to passively take up, again, more carbon from the atmosphere without changing biology. So a lot of the questions that scientists in my field are asking now is, should we be doing any of these? How would they work? And that's really the question that I want us to get at. So the first set of questions we have to ask before we would want to implement any of these is first, are they harmful? Is there some sort of like unintended ecological side effect to doing this that we're not willing to risk? And so that is one of the questions people are trying to understand. And it's a hard question to ask because if you want to know if you're harming the ocean ecosystem you're perturbing, that requires you to have pretty good baseline data on what the ecosystem is like in the first place. And also, importantly, you don't want to wait until the harm has already been done before you figure out that it's happened. You either want to be able to detect it early or predict that that harm is going to happen and not do it in the first place. But then second, okay, we decide it's not harmful. Does this actually work? Does it take up carbon from the atmosphere, or did we just like dump some stuff in the ocean and it didn't really make a difference to the carbon budget? And so that requires us to be able to understand the mechanism to anticipate that it's going to work, but also to be able to actually measure not just that it worked, like kind of sort of, but like how much, because people want to sell carbon credits on a market. So they have to say, well, how much carbon did they actually take up? Can we measure and verify how much carbon was absorbed? And then importantly, we also have to ask, is this more carbon than the ocean would have taken up in the first place, right? Did you just go out and measure like, hooray, the ocean is taking up carbon from the atmosphere in a place that it was already happening? Or did you take up extra carbon because of the intervention that you did? And similarly, is that carbon actually going to be stored on some agreed upon human relevant timescales, right? Not like weeks or months or even a couple of years, but like decades to centuries to be relevant on climate timescales, right? And the way I was saying that if you store carbon in a forest, but then there's a forest fire, you lose that stored carbon. The same kind of thing. If you move that carbon into the deep ocean, but then that carbon upwells to the surface because of ocean circulation, and then it outgasses back to the atmosphere, that's not actually durable carbon storage. So we have to think about how to tell whether that carbon is extra beyond what would have been stored otherwise, and also whether it's going to be stored long enough term to actually make a difference for climate. And then there's a final piece, which I'm not going to get into, but I think is really important and requires scientists to work together with people outside of technical scientific fields to think about policy, is will people support these interventions financially and consent to them politically, right? Are we going to have people who say, yeah, it turns out this works, but not in my backyard? And then if so, you know, how do we think about whose backyard we should put it in? What is fair and just in deciding who should pay for this? All of those kinds of really important, difficult questions. So where does the kind of work that I do come into this? Well, all of these things that I said that we need to figure out require us to have baseline data on the ocean carbon cycle. And so this map I've now plotted on top of our baseline map of exchange of carbon between the ocean and atmosphere, the places that we have long-term monitoring of ocean biogeochemistry. So in the same way we know about the increase in carbon in the atmosphere because of this amazing time series record of CO2 from the Keeling curve, there are places that we have long time series measurements of biogeochemistry in the ocean. But it's actually not that many sites, each of these yellow dots. And I'm particularly interested in the high latitude ocean because those are the places that already are taking up the most carbon from the atmosphere, the bluest regions on the map. And there's actually only 5 sites at latitudes greater than 45 degrees where we have these ongoing marine biogeochemical time series. And these sites, I'm going to argue, are really key to understanding how the ocean absorbs and cycles carbon today. And we need that understanding, and frankly, a lot more understanding than we already have to be able to answer the questions we need if we want to consider marine carbon dioxide removal. So I'm going to tell you a story about this site in the subpolar North Atlantic, where I've been working for about the past 10 years to try to understand the carbon cycling happening at this one site in one of the strongest carbon sink regions in the globe. So I'm really interested in the subpolar North Atlantic, first because it is really exciting for the biology. This is an animation of satellite chlorophyll, so the chlorophyll from phytoplankton in the surface ocean observed from space, and we can see this greening up that happens on a seasonal basis every summer. So when you hear about a phytoplankton bloom in the ocean, this location in the subpolar North Atlantic is the textbook example. And so right at this location, the Ocean Observatories Initiative, funded by the National Science Foundation in 2014, installed this Erminger Sea array. And so we can look at the interactions between the biology and physics at this site. Because not only is the biology really important, the physics here is also really wild because there are these huge storms that blow across the ice sheets of Greenland and drive super deep mixing in the winter. We have a strong decrease in the layer that's in contact with the atmosphere down to greater than 1,000 meters in winter. That's a kilometer of water that's turbulently mixed and in contact with the atmosphere. Super wild, exciting physics. And so we can think about how the biology interacts with this physics, where in the spring we have phytoplankton photosynthesizing, converting carbon dioxide into organic carbon, and a fraction of that organic carbon sinks out of the surface ocean into the deeper layers. But that's not the end of the story, because as it sinks through the deep ocean, those sinking particles are consumed and respired by heterotrophic organisms. And then a fraction of that respired carbon is entrained back into the mixed layer when it deepens in winter. And so unless that carbon sinks below that deepest layer in contact with the atmosphere each year, it's not actually stored on these kind of durable timescales, even just from this natural carbon cycle. It has to get deep enough to be stored on these long timescales. So what I've been trying to chase down using the data from this site has been, can we put together this fairly simple equation that's actually been really hard to solve? How much carbon is biologically sequestered at this site each year to tell us what fraction of the uptake from the atmosphere is due to biology versus physics? And to do that, we have to know how much carbon is leaving the surface ocean, how much is coming back each winter due to that winter ventilation, and the difference is going to tell us about our biologically sequestered carbon. Well, to do that, I've been using this amazing array that's been installed by this Ocean Observatories initiative in the Erminger Sea. This is a picture of a buoy like the one you saw in the title slide on a ship where here I am again, the third time I appear in this talk together with some of my undergraduate students and the team from OOI that went out, and they go out every single summer basically to collect everything that's been deployed the year before and put out a new set of instruments for the next year. And so we have this surface buoy. It has a whole bunch of things hanging down on it, all the way down to the anchor on the seafloor. And then you're also going to see some data that comes from a subsurface profiler mooring. And so this is this wire walker that actually moves up and down a wire from this subsurface floating mooring all the way down to just above the seafloor, and this wire walker moves up and down collecting data. And then to fill out this array, there are also two other moorings, and these underwater gliders. You can think of them as like little robots or underwater submarines that make profiles between the surface and 1,000 meters transiting around this array. So I'm going to jump over all of the nitty-gritty work that we had to do to actually synthesize the data and show you some really cool results from PhD student Meg Yoder, who's been working with me. And so she pulled together 7 years of surface carbon data collected from this array, and she used it to put together a budget for how much carbon the biology was drawing down in the surface layer throughout the year. And so this is the seasonal cycle. We have the mean seasonal cycle across all of these years in black, and then the individual 7 years she looked at in the colors. And similar to here, she has, you know, the overall rate in black and all of these different colors here. And so the numbers aren't super important. I didn't give you enough context to really know what they mean, but compared to other places in the world, these are a big number for how much carbon is being drawn down by the biology each year. And that's not surprising because of this big phytoplankton bloom, but it actually had never been measured over the full year at this site before. But actually, equally and maybe even more important is that, you know, this is a big number, but the number varies a lot from year to year. And that's really important if you imagine the kind of thing you would want to do for marine carbon dioxide removal. If I went out in this year and I did something that actually did nothing, I could think that I had removed a lot of carbon from the system if I was just comparing it to the baseline mean. And so if you want to do one of these marine carbon dioxide removal projects, you need to understand the underlying interannual variability at the site and either pick somewhere that's not like this one with this really high interannual variability, or you need to understand the drivers of that interannual variability well enough to understand whether what you're seeing is the result of what would have happened anyway just because of that natural variability, or actually something that was because of your intervention. But we actually haven't answered the whole story yet, right? We've just thought about how much carbon left the surface ocean, but we want to know how much is stored long term. So from Meg's work, we know that a lot of carbon is leaving the surface ocean. And she also interestingly saw that a lot of that carbon was actually leaving in early spring, that there was a lot of productivity before the classic bloom starts that we can see from chlorophyll from space, and was actually being detrained into this deeper part of the water column. But we haven't yet figured out how much of that comes back the next winter to know how much is stored long term. So the next step we took, led by former postdoc Kristen Fogren, who's now a research scientist in my group, was to look at oxygen throughout the full water column. And so here you can see this time series of oxygen with higher oxygen in the darker colors and lower oxygen in the lighter colors. And we can see the depths of mixing each year, which vary quite a lot from year to year. And you can also see this interesting pattern where the color sort of changes while we're in this stratified portion of the year when the mixed layer is shallow. So we can look in a little bit more detail at that, and we can see each year the oxygen decreases on all of these depths until it's mixed back into contact with the atmosphere the next winter. And that is our signal of respiration, of sinking stuff coming from above that's being respired. So using up oxygen, putting carbon back into the water. And there's more sinking stuff at 250 meters, so the oxygen goes down faster. And as we get farther down through the water column, we don't respire quite as fast because there's not as much stuff to be respired, but we still see that decrease in oxygen. So using those data for all 7 years in our data set, Kristen was able to put together this full budget looking at the amount of carbon that was being respired with depth from about 50 meters all the way down to 1,500 meters. And so we can calculate that the amount exported is the amount we have at the top. The amount sequestered is the amount that gets below that deep mix layer the subsequent winter. And all the stuff in the middle is actually respired and then ventilated back to the atmosphere the next winter, rather than actually being stored long term. So we can put that together and actually tell for each one of these years, we have how much was seasonally exported, how much of it came back the next winter, and then how much was actually stored long term in gray. And interestingly, there's some years where even though we have a huge amount of carbon leaving the surface ocean, all of it comes back the next winter because of that deep winter mixing. So now we can put together this story. We're answering our original question, and we can see that we have a lot of carbon that left the surface ocean. We can see that most of it is re-entrained back into the mixed layer, and only a fairly small part of it is getting below this winter ventilation depth. But there's also this thing where Kristen's number doesn't match Meg's number. And we were like, what's going on with that? What did we miss? Did we do the calculations wrong? Or is there something that's making this not all add up? And it turns out, so another line of evidence, this is data looked at by Jose Cuevas, a former master's student working with me, looked at these really fast sinking particles. And so during the spring bloom, we get these big aggregates, we get zooplankton fecal pellets, and they just rocket down through the water column. And so here we can see I've just highlighted these big particle pulses in gray arrows so that you can see them. After the spring bloom, every single year we see these pulses of big particles, and we can trace these pulses all the way down to 2,000 meters. So down below the area that we could actually see any respiration from our oxygen signal. And so we think that that's actually the piece we were missing, that there's a little bit more carbon being stored than we could catch with our oxygen-based method, because in this site, we have these really fast sinking particles. And so when we put that together, we now have this additional piece of large particles adding to our carbon sequestration. And we were also able to figure out that there's at least 2 different pools of carbon moving organic carbon out of the surface ocean. We have these really fast sinking particles that are rocketing down that we're not catching in our oxygen respiration. And then we also have this signal of detrainment when our mixed layer shallows. It leaves these particles behind that are then slowly respired within the water column while actually being suspended or slowly sinking over the course of the year. So we've been able to put this story together. And one of the main things I want you to take away here is, man, is this complicated. And it's really hard, given how we're just starting to put together how it works today, to imagine how we would be able to actually modify this system and know that we had modified it without causing harm in a way that actually successfully worked and that durably stored carbon beyond what was there to begin with. So we can get back to this question: can the ocean clean up our carbon mass? On the first hand, yes. The ocean has already absorbed about 26% of our anthropogenic carbon emissions. So absolutely, thank you, ocean, doing a great job and going to keep doing that job, although less and less if we keep ramping up our emissions. But also, no, right? The idea that we would commit to this moral hazard of saying, well, the ocean can clean up our mess, so let's keep emitting and not worry about it. Definitely not. We definitely know that we need to stop emissions. We need to turn off that faucet of adding more carbon to the atmosphere, stop making this mess. We can't depend on the ocean to fix our problems. But then the more nuanced piece where we are now is, for really understandable reasons, as we have failed to stop these emissions earlier, people are thinking, well, what can we do from where we are? And marine carbon dioxide removal proposals are rapidly gaining traction. And I think some of them are promising. And my take, though I want to sort of leave this open for discussion, is broadly that the abiotic approaches are more tractable, a little bit easier to monitor and get our heads around, and likely to be more successful than the biotic approaches. But I think there's good reasons that people are researching and, starting startups and trying to figure out how we could do every single one of these, because we need a whole menu of solutions on the table. But I think it's really important that everyone who's in this space is aware that the complexity of the ocean carbon cycle makes it so challenging to determine whether any of these would work and if the carbon removed is additional or durable. And a lot more work is needed on monitoring, reporting, and verification, as well as on policies for what that monitoring, reporting, and verification would have to be as this brand new sector of the climate space is really rapidly growing. And so one final piece that I want to get to before we finish, a little bit self-serving, but I think also really important in thinking about what we need in the scientific baseline for this work, is the importance of these marine biogeochemical time series. And this is a really great paper led by a colleague of mine, and I'm just going to read this little quote to you. My colleague Heather Benway writes, "Sustained ocean time series are critical for characterizing marine ecosystem shifts in a time of accelerating and at times unpredictable changes. They represent the only means to distinguish between natural and anthropogenic forcings. Since the inception of sustained ocean observations, ocean time series have withstood many challenges, most prominently availability of uninterrupted funding and retention of trained personnel. And that's really important in the modern moment where all of us here in the US are aware that this is not a time that is great for science funding, for retention of trained personnel, and for continuing these really important records. And the Ocean Observatories Initiative site where I've been working has actually been under threat because of this. The White House budget for 2026 proposed major cuts to the National Science Foundation, and particularly major cuts to this Ocean Observatories Initiative, which I think would be really short-sighted for providing the kind of data we need long-term. So I wanted to in addition to thanking the folks in my lab group here, all the folks from the OOI team, really give a shout out to the importance of federal funding to continuing, as probably many of you are already, in advocating for continuing the scientific enterprise to understand what's happening in these ecosystems and in the global carbon cycle, to give us a shot at being able to actually be able to look forward to, can we do any kind of marine carbon dioxide removal long term? If that's going to work, maybe you're super for it, maybe you're super against it. But if we're going to answer those questions, we need these kinds of baseline data. And so I'll leave you with this conclusion slide. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. That was such a fascinating talk, and it really underscores the importance of fundamental research to answer much broader questions. But I'm going to open it for questions first. If not, I have a few myself.
That was a terrific talk. And I think you had a lot of wonderful graphics with the colors that both were beautiful to look at and presented the information well. As you said, your example with the bathtub is just a metaphor. And while it can give us the idea, we shouldn't look to it for, exact answers about how the phenomena works. And you also had a lot of graphs that essentially went more or less linearly upwards. And you talked a bit about tipping points, and you were a little bit skeptical about those exactly. But my understanding is that there is a whole bunch of frozen methane gas that's in very cold parts of the ocean called methane hydrates. And if we get to a certain point where the global temperatures, the temperatures of the ocean warm that, then all that methane, which is very significant greenhouse gas, gets into the atmosphere and it becomes a runaway effect, and maybe Earth looks like Venus. And then the other thing, another example about particular tipping points that come up is, I think maybe 10 or 20,000 years ago, there was this big lake in what's Canada with a whole bunch of fresh water, but it was contained there by basically ice all along the edge. And then when the global temperatures got up high enough, that ice melted, and then suddenly all that water went into the oceans and it changed everything. So there really are these tipping points, and boy, things could get really bad if we reach one of those.
Yeah, so I think that question, absolutely, of tipping points is a really, really big one. And I'm glad you brought it up, because certainly the relationship between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and temperature, I think we know, is very linear. But some of those tipping points, so for instance, thinking about methane hydrate or thinking about other ways that we could have right, what we talk about is a positive feedback, but they're the bad things that we don't want to have happen. A feedback that would then lead to an increase in carbon in the atmosphere certainly could lead to an acceleration of the rate of climate change. Right now, it doesn't seem like we're on the precipice of any particular one of those tipping points. So there's been a lot of focus on those kinds of tipping points, as could we have a runaway climate that's going to end up like Venus? I think the answer is no. But there are a number of other kinds of things we could think about. And I actually worry more about tipping points that are relevant for people So things like we could have a tipping point in sea level rise where we destabilize the Antarctic ice sheet. And so the relationship between temperature and CO2 is not the only part of climate change we care about, right? Temperature is a proxy, but it's a proxy for things like heat waves, things like hurricanes, things like sea level rise. Those are the things that are causing problems for people, right? We could also imagine destabilizing the Amazon rainforest. That's a huge biodiversity loss. And also, if we lost the carbon stored in the Amazon rainforest, that could then end up with more carbon in the atmosphere. So I think there's lots of reasons basically to say we don't know where those are. And so that's why we want to keep within 1.5 degrees or even less, because we don't know exactly if those things would happen, or if they would happen when in that climate trajectory they would come.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really wonderful. I have two questions, if that's all right. The first, I'm curious if there's a periodicity to these events of like really deep mixing across years that could be kind of leveraged just to increase the durability of carbon sinking, if that's something that we do. And then the other question I had, which kind of had to do with the map of spots of carbon sinks and upwellings, that was a little bit surprising just because I know that there tends to be more phytoplankton at those spots of upwellings. And I'm curious if there's a way to kind of like enhance either like the marine snow, which you were talking about a little bit, or a way to make that carbon capture a little bit more durable in those really high off-gassing points.
Yeah, both great questions. Do you have a preference for which one I talk about first?
Not at all.
Okay. Well, let me start with the second question, which was thinking about what's happening in these different regions. So so we have our subpolar gyres and our subtropical gyres here. And so a lot of what's going on is that in our subpolar gyres, we have upwelling of nutrients. And so that's where you have higher productivity. And it's also where you have colder waters. Here we have downwelling, and so that reduces the amount of productivity, and that also is much warmer water that's less able to take up carbon from the atmosphere. Sort of like a side note on this, the reason you have such high outgassing along the equator is we have equatorial upwelling, so that's a very productive site, but it's also bringing up waters that have a lot of deep respired carbon stored in them. There have been some proposals thinking about sort of in the same way I said we could add iron to some of the iron limited locations. People have talked about, well, in a place like Hawaii, we know that there's not enough nitrate at the surface to fuel more production, but there's a lot of nitrate at depth. So what if we just pumped up some of that nitrate from depth and we use that to increase production at the surface? All of those run into the same kinds of questions that I was thinking about in my work. If it's actually much easier to fuel production in the surface ocean than to ensure that that production then translates into long-term durable carbon storage. And a lot of our initial studies were really trying to understand the ecosystem effects. We went out in ships. We measured what happened when we added nutrients to the surface ocean. The longest studies stayed for like 2 months, a huge amount of time at sea, but no one was staying for years to see what happened through the winter and then the next summer. And so there's now the advent of these newer sensor technologies on autonomous floats, as well as on the kinds of platforms I was talking about that we can use to try to look at that. And no one was doing these studies to actually ask about like, okay, but really, should we pump up nutrients from below or add iron to the ocean? And so there are some proposals by some of my colleagues within the community saying like, well, we need to go out and do more studies trying to ask, like, what if we really did this as a carbon dioxide removal project? I would say there's a range of opinions in the community as to whether it has enough promise to be worth doing that study or whether it like just sounds really fun because who doesn't want funding to go out and do a really awesome study and see everything that happens? But certainly I would say we haven't had a chance to really do the studies to tell whether it would work. I think there is renewed interest in trying because of, feeling like, well, we need to try every option on the table, but also a lot of skepticism within the community. And I'll get you in just a second. You had another question, and that other question was about the variability of the physics. The short answer to that question is that we don't think there's something that's easily predictable in the same way like the North Atlantic Oscillation or El Nino could get at those kinds of things. But there's a lot of interest in trying to understand this. And there's also a question of whether there might be long-term changes in the physics under climate change. So there's a lot of interest in really trying to understand that, but we currently don't have good predictability for it.